Okay, welcome to the 20th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019, and I remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones. Agenda item 1 is consideration of whether to take agenda item 4 in private. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you, that is agreed. Agenda item 2, the committee will hold its concluding evidence session with the Minister on its inquiry into empty homes in Scotland, and I welcome Kevin Stewart, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, who's accompanied by David Cowan, Head of Regeneration Unit, and Fiona Hepburn, Housing Markets Policy Officer, Scottish Government. I believe, Minister, you'd like to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener. I welcome the committee's inquiry and want to thank everyone who has expressed a view and engaged so positively. The committee will be aware that we are engaging with the public and stakeholders about how our homes and communities should look and feel in 2040. And our vision for 2040 envisages a Scotland where no homes are left empty without good reason. I think that's something that we should all aspire to. Bringing homes back into use is cost effective and of course increases supply. And the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership brought 1,128 privately owned empty homes back into use last year. That's a rise of over 300 homes. More than 90% of these are attributable to empty homes officers. And that's why I continue to invest in the partnership and doubled our funding to more than £400,000 per year until 2021. And my ambition is to see empty homes officers working in every part of Scotland, and I'm pleased that progress is being made on that front. We also, Convener, made changes to council tax legislation in 2013. Which allowed councils to apply and vary a levy of up to 100% on long-term empty homes. The reclassification of homes that followed increased the number of empty homes with a corresponding drop in second homes. This means owners face higher levy contributions to offset the negative effects of empty homes in our communities. And I suspect the changes have made the number of underused houses in Scotland much clearer. And while we've achieved good results, it is time to examine our approach to empty homes more thoroughly. This year, we will review the work of the partnership, our support funds, council tax statistics and international comparators to consider what we could do better to bring more homes into use. I know that the committee are interested in our plans for compulsory purchase order and compulsory sales order. On CPOs, some authorities are already using their powers to tackle empty homes. Over the last 3 years, 13 CPOs have been submitted under housing legislation. All 13 were approved and 9 involved the compulsory acquisition of empty homes in some form. We are working with the Empty Homes Partnership to support authorities to use their existing powers. And we have committed to introduce a new CSO power for local authorities. Given the pressure for space in the legislative programme and the potential implications of Brexit on resources and parliamentary time, I don't expect to be in a position to progress a CSO bill in this parliamentary session. But we remain, as a government, committed to progressing this work. This will allow us to take the time needed to work through issues and challenges with current proposals that stakeholders have identified. For example, as a CSO would result in the expropriation of property in support of the public interest, we must ensure that that process is compatible with the EEHCR. There are also questions about how conditions of sale could be attached to a property title via a CSO. We therefore want to take more time and bring forward a package of proposals that addresses how authorities can assemble land, tackle problem properties and capture land value uplifts ready for the next administration to introduce legislation. And of course, Convener, I hope that that next administration is an SNP one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thanks for your fairly full response there. And a lot of the issues that you raised will be delved into later on. But can I ask you, we've heard from stakeholders to date there are many reasons why properties become empty, and the reasons can be complex. Given what you've said already, what is your assessment of the scale of the issue, and is there any further actions from what you mentioned there that you plan to take?
Convener, we continue to listen to those that are on the front line dealing with us. And during the course of the summer, I took the opportunity to discuss empty homes and empty homes officers with some local authorities. Ms Hepburn and I visited Falkirk, who have 2 empty homes officers. And we talked around about what flexibilities they might require to provide an even better service than they are currently doing. They are a very good authority in what they have done, and plaudits to them for putting in place 2 empty homes officers. But we are always willing to listen to see if there are flexibilities that we can put in to the system to allow them to do even more. And that includes looking at how we or how they use the Empty Homes Loan Fund, for example.
Okay, thank you. Do you think there's a national response that's required to deal with the issue of empty homes, given it is an issue found all across Scotland? And if so, how do you feel this could be achieved?
Convener, we have taken a national approach in terms of the Empty Homes Partnership, and I think that partnership between the government and Shelter is paying dividends in the areas where empty homes officers have been established. We can see quite quickly the difference that an empty homes officer can make in a local authority area. Again, over the summer in the Western Isles, who appointed an empty homes officer in only October 2018, they were already talking about the benefits that that has brought to the Outer Hebrides. There are some 500 long-term empty properties in the Western Isles. And that Empty Homes Officer, which is funded by the Council and the Empty Homes Partnership, has already led to a situation where 82 homes are undergoing refurbishment renovation. 32 of the homes have been sold privately. 3 properties have been sold by Auction House Scotland, and 8 properties are now rented out. Beyond that, the Empty Homes Officer there has also managed to reach agreements with some local companies around about discounting for some of the work. So these things can be achieved very, very quickly. Now, that has all come from the council itself, and they know that place better than anyone else. So while I am happy and have doubled the money for the Empty Homes Partnership, and I'm happy for government to play a part in this, the on-the-ground delivery of filling up these homes should be a matter for the local authorities who know their areas best. It is disappointing, Convener, though, that a number of councils still have not appointed empty homes officers, and I really do think that those councils need to look at what has happened, the positive benefits that have happened in other areas when empty homes officers have been appointed. Certainly, my discussions with Callum Ian McKeever in the Western Isles quite clearly shows the difference that an empty homes officer has made there in a very, very short period of time.
Okay, thank you. And just finally from me, how do you see the issue of empty homes being addressed as part of the wider town centre regeneration agenda? And I accept that's not particularly your remit, but particularly for those areas such as New Milns, which we visited, which have declining populations and are facing wider economic and demographic challenges?
Convener, I haven't visited New Milns. I've spoken to some members of the committee who were there, so I won't talk about the specifics of New Milns if you don't mind. I think it's extremely important that we create vibrant town centres, and that's one of the reasons why the government put forward the £50 million Capital Town Centre Fund to enable local authorities to stimulate and support a wide range of investments which encourage town centres to diversify and flourish. We also have encouraged local authorities to look at the town centre first principle, which many local authorities have put in place. I think one of the things, if you don't mind, is I'd like to talk a little bit about Dumfries, which is an area that I have visited. And I visited Dumfries very early on after being appointed to this post to see the work that was going on in the town centre there, particularly work being led by the Stove Network. And I took the opportunity while visiting to talk to a number of folks in the town centre itself who do business there. At that point, there was only one household left in the town centre of Dumfries. One household. So lots of buildings up above shops, completely and utterly unused, which I'm sure we can all agree is really disappointing. I have to say that I applaud Dumfries and Galloway Council for the efforts that they have made in recent times to turn that around. They have established a £1 million fund from the council tax levy to ensure that there are moves forward to improve and to revitalise the town centre there. Now, this shows quite clearly, with the flexibilities that we have in place, that local authorities can make those decisions and make real differences to people's lives. Dumfries and Galloway are a very good example of what can be done, and they're at the very early stages of this. And I hope that other local authorities will look to see what is going on there so that they can move forward in the same front.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Minister. You've touched on the success and the benefits of the Empty Homes Officer, and during evidence we certainly found that those that did have, and you've identified already this morning in listing a number of councils you visited yourself that have seen that. So should the Empty Homes Officer be part of the local authority's housing strategy?
Yes, I think it should be, Mr. Stewart. I don't think there is absolutely any doubt about that. And they can use the money that they take in from the levy to employ Empty Homes Officers. And I think that in so doing, they are going to get that investment back again and again and again by utilising empty properties. Often, these properties are a blight in a community and cause real difficulties for those folks living close by. And I can't, for the life of me, understand, being a former councillor myself, why it would be that, knowing what we know now, that you wouldn't put an Empty Homes Officer in place.
I mean, from my own cold council, Perth and Kinross, they were quite pioneering at what they did in the past, and it has proved to be very successful. But some of them say it's because they don't have the resource to provide that. Now, I find that difficult in some respects, but I can understand that when they're looking at priorities, Minister, about how they want to manage that and their housing strategy, what they want to see being achieved. Because in as you've also identified, in some locations, the easy ones that are the houses that are easy to get back on track can do. It's the much more hard to find in the difficulties with ownership and location that then set the real challenge for these empty home officers and for councils to try and achieve that. And you've identified, Dumfries, etc., where there are a large number that are one floor above or in a different location. So what do you think should be the main focus of these empty homes officers to ensure that they get the best process within their communities?
I think it's very difficult for me to say what the best use of the empty homes officer resource is, because that will be different in different local authorities. And I think, in some cases, when empty homes officers are appointed, it's often very easy to get a number of homes back into use quickly, because there is low-hanging fruit out there, as you well say. It may be properties that have not been empty for that long. But some of the things which have gone on in certain places is actually tackling buildings which have been empty for some time. I've always been amazed at the award ceremony which is held for empty homes officers about some of the projects that have brought long-term blights into communities back into use. Now that takes time. However, I would say that is a resource that is well spent, because at the end of the day, I see a lot of this, as do many of the folks who are positive about empty homes officers, as being spending to save. And it's not just about the fact of bringing all of these homes back into use, which is obviously extremely important. It is about making communities safer again. One of the, let's go to Falkirk. One of the houses that Ms Hepburn and I went to look at in Falkirk, which was a beautiful old house, had been a beautiful old house. If that had been dealt with at an early stage, it would have been much, much better. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case in this one. That's going to take a lot of work to bring back to use. But meanwhile, while all of this has been going on over the piece, that hasn't been good for the community around about that house and what they've had to bear. And in that case, I would hasten to add, Convener, that I'm not laying the blame of the length of time on this one at the door of the empty homes officers in Falkirk. Far from it, because I think that they have done their level best. But, these are the kind of things that if we move in at early stages, that we can resolve quite quickly, rather than creating difficulties not only for the local authority itself, but also for other services like the police and the fire service and others who are often involved in having to deal with some of the nonsenses that go on when a property becomes derelict.
And I think you identify that, because being proactive, and the committee went and visited and did locations that we've gone to see where you've identified exactly that, where there was a blight in the community in a building that was difficult to try and find, but once they got through that and then they were proactive in making it happen, then it transformed that community, because that was then removed and you then had something that was usable, that the community could see had improved. So it's about the local authority themselves being proactive in trying to identify where they can and what they can achieve. But as I've said, in some locations, it was coming down to resource and funding about how that could be managed, because it takes a lot for them to manage the one house or one location that had taken years to progress. Easier ones, as you say, low-hanging fruit were much easier to achieve. So that was the biggest stumbling block to some of the locations and the authorities themselves, as to the length of time it would take for that to be proactive.
Convener, as I said, one of the discussions that we had in Falkirk was around about is there a requirement for more flexibility around about some of the packages that we have in place already? And, I'm always keen to look and see if things are working appropriately. You know, the other thing about funding is, you know, I see this very much as spending to save anyway. And I think that the resource that may be put in by a local authority will come back much, much more in terms of value than what they put in.
Thank you.
Thank you. You wanted to come in?
Yeah, just following on from that line of questioning, I know you know you don't want to go into councils and beat them with a big stick and tell them what they have to do. So, of that handful of councils that don't have empty homes officers, what have you been doing to try to persuade them to take somebody on?
I think that Mr Simpson and others have heard me even in the chamber saying to councils, I think in answer to Alison Johnson not so long ago, I said that, you know, the Edinburgh and Lothians MSP should be encouraging Edinburgh Council to take on an empty homes officer, and certainly that's come out in discussions that I've had with the local authority, and you know, that will continue to be the case, and I will also continue to highlight the difference that these folks make. You know, I gave the example of the Western Isles. That's an authority that's had an empty homes officer for less than a year. And already you are seeing the difference. Yeah. Now, for this city, where, you know, there is a real difficulty for some folk in accessing housing, I would have thought that the logical step for this city would be to utilise every single thing that they can to bring homes back into use. Having an empty homes officer here would make sense, as it would in every other authority that currently doesn't have one. And we've made this as easy as we possibly can in terms of the Empty Homes Partnership, because the advice is there. Shahina Din, who heads up the project, is absolutely excellent. They can call upon the advice of the partnership. And, you know, I think that everything here is positive. They just need to get on with it.
Well, Shahina Din, of course, gave evidence to the committee. She was very impressive. But if a tiny council like Falkirk can employ 2 empty homes officers, and we've got a council like Edinburgh not employing any, that seems to be, to me, to be extraordinary. So I just wonder, you know, is there a job of work to be done? Maybe, you know, from MSPs and yourself as the housing minister, to sell the benefits to councils that don't have them?
Convener, I will continue to try and sell the benefits of having empty homes officers. As Mr Simpson well knows, sometimes the government is accused of centralisation, so I don't want to force people to do things necessarily, but there is a huge benefit in councils employing empty homes officers. And, you know, Mr Simpson has pointed out the fact that Falkirk, quite a small council, has 2 empty homes officers. They're reaping the benefits of that, absolutely reaping the benefits of that. And, you know, others could be and should be doing likewise.
Andy?
Oh, great, sorry. Thanks very much, Convener. Minister, I want to talk about powers of enforcement, and you talked about compulsory purchase orders, and you've done a bit of work, I gather, speaking to councils, encouraging their use and all the rest of it. Yeah. What lessons have arisen from that in relationship to the ability of councils to use CPOs, particularly for recovering empty homes?
If Mr Whiteman bears with me, there have been, I think, if I remember off the top of my head, because I can't find it, 13 CPOs which have been asked for recently. 9 of those have progressed. All 13 were accepted. I've got a very small team. I heard this morning it's a smaller team because somebody has moved on elsewhere, who are dealing with CPOs at this moment in time. They have made themselves available to all local authorities in terms of help that may be required. That doesn't mean to say that my officials can do the CPO for the authority, but they will give guidance where required. We have refreshed, as I think the committee already knows, CPO guidance. That was one of the things which I wanted to do at a very early stage, and we have done that and held a number of training sessions around about this, including with a combined event with Shelter, which I think will bear fruit as we move forward. So we have made those changes, and I remain committed to ensuring that my officials will help where they can. I think there is, and some of the former councillors on the committee will maybe attest to this as well. I think that there's a requirement for some culture change in terms of the use of CPOs. Because certainly when I was on Aberdeen City, there was a bit of risk averseness in terms of using compulsory purchase powers. Local authorities were more than willing to do so for the likes of transport projects, but were much more wary when it came to dealing with CPOs for housing or regeneration projects. And I think we have got to play a role in removing that risk aversity. So as well as making this as simple as possible in terms of the guidance, we have a job of work to do, I think all of us, in terms of changing that culture and making it the norm that CPOs should be looked at for housing or regeneration projects. To highlight the figures that I was trying to remember off the top of my head, and I wasn't far off the mark. 13 housing CPOs in the last 3 years, 9 acquisitions of empty homes. The average turnaround for those CPOs has reduced from 377 to 160 days. And a recent case confirmed was done in 21 days. So I think the refresh of the guidance and some of the work that we have done is beginning to see some benefits.
So 9 over 3 years is hardly significant. It's neither here nor there, really. In 2015, the Scottish Law Commission published a final report on a broad refresh and reform of the laws of compulsory purchase orders to make them easier to use. You don't seem to have done anything to progress those recommendations.
Well, I would disagree, because we have refreshed the compulsory purchase order guidance, and we are
I'm talking about the law.
And we are looking, as I said in my opening statement, to look at the law in terms of compulsory purchase order, compulsory sale order, and land value capture. Now, I think that most folk around the table here recognise that this is a huge amount of work. We have to unpick the 1845 Act, and we have to build a system which is compliant with EHCR and balances everybody's rights. I am committed to doing so. We will progress that work. That work will not move at the pace that I would have liked, convener, but I spelled out in the opening statement, that there are a number of issues at this moment in time, which means that a huge amount of our legal officers, the government solicitors, are tied up with other things, including Brexit. I'm quite sure that this committee does not want to see a slapdash bill which may not work, may not be compliant with EHCR, and which would fall down quite quickly. We need to get this right. Beyond the comments that Mr. Whiteman made about not many CPOs, I agree with him on that front. But what we are seeing is many more local authorities looking to use these powers. I'm never one to chance my luck, but I know that a number of local authorities at this moment are looking at progressing a number of CPOs. That comes from discussions only this week. So I think we are seeing a change. It's maybe not fast enough for folks around this table. It's not fast enough for me, but we are seeing that change.
You mentioned compulsory sale orders. The government consulted on these in the summer of 2015, and ministers at the time said they were committed to bringing these forward this parliamentary term. You had a manifesto commitment. I quote from your manifesto: "We will bring forward proposals to modernise and improve powers for compulsory sale orders." You say that Brexit and other priorities have got in the way. What are those other priorities that are more important?
Well, I think Brexit is taking a huge...
Given that you've had 4 years.
I think Brexit is taking a huge amount of effort from everyone within government. And I would rather that those efforts were elsewhere. Beyond that, I think Mr Whiteman also needs to take cognizance of the fact that the government also established the Scottish Land Commission to look at these issues. And I think it would be remiss of us not to take on board the recommendations from the Scottish Land Commission when we are formulating legislation. We will move forward in this front. I've said so in my opening statement. It's not at the pace that I would have liked, but we are where we are.
Thank you. Just to confirm, the Scottish Land Commission has produced its report on that. I mean, everything's in place for you to take this forward, but I accept your comments about priorities, etc. Can I just pick up the town centre point that the convener raised as well? Because I recall that at the town centre review that I think Malcolm Fraser led in 2013 highlighted the fact there's 10,000 empty properties above shops in town centres. And you mentioned Dumfries, and there are other towns, many towns, where flats above shops are empty. What work's been done to try and specifically address that? Because he made recommendations, as I recall, around non-domestic rates and things that could incentivise business owners who were reluctant to let property above shops to incentivise them to bring them into use. Has anything further been done on that front?
Convener, I don't have the recommendations from the 2013 report that Mr Whiteman mentions at my fingertips. I will go and have a look at that report again. What I would say is that in terms of the efforts that the government has made in recent times with the commitment, the £50 million for town centres and our efforts to try and get local authorities to look at the town centre first principle, that gives the impetus for local authorities to look at their town centres as a whole. And to move forward in utilising all of the space in those town centres. I would encourage all local authorities to look at what is going on in Dumfries, to see if what is going on there is suitable for them, and to utilise the resource, the flexibility that has been built in to ensure that these buildings come back into use. I should also say that in all of this, Scotland's Towns Partnership are a very good base for local authorities to seek advice, and they will, without doubt, help support local authorities on these issues.
Okay, thanks, Gordon.
Thank you. Annabelle, you wanted to come in?
Thanks, Peter. Good morning. Minister, just picking up on the issues of CPOs in particular, and I note the Minister says that obviously looking at the more CPOs and CSOs in a more comprehensive way will require quite a lot of manpower and time. But I would have thought that, I mean, one of the issues that has been put to us by various local authorities is that they regard the CPO procedure as overly complicated. And I just wonder, would it not be worthwhile to have officials reflect on and discuss with councils what specifically they find particularly complicated and difficult, and therefore drill that down to see if, in advance of a more comprehensive look at the whole issue, in advance of that, there is not perhaps something that could be done in the interim, perhaps via secondary legislation, to at least help the process on a bit, because that certainly was a consistent issue raised with the committee. And it surely is not beyond the wit to identify some issues that could be dealt with. And I appreciate Mr. Woughton's point. This wouldn't be simply a question of guidance. This would be, you know, a question of changing those processes such that progress could be made.
Convener, I thank Ms Ewing for that question, because it gives me the opportunity again to highlight the fact that I don't think that this is necessarily all about the changes of changing guidance, or even, you know, the amount of support that is being offered here. It is also about culture change. That there is a culture change that is required in terms of the use of CPOs. What we have done is to look at that guidance. I think we have simplified it to such a huge degree. And we have, as I said, had those training sessions with a number of folks to try and move that forward. Over the next few months, we'll develop further technical advice in terms of aspects of the CPO process. And we'll also look at whether more training is required. We will, as always, consult with key stakeholders to help us in preparing that advice, and of course to provide us with the necessary knowledge about future legislative reform as well. Now, I was in Glasgow yesterday, in the East End of Glasgow, and we touched upon CPOs there, which I didn't expect to do, I have to say. And, you know, Glasgow are never backward at coming forward in terms of letting us know where they think things are not particularly right. I would be happy for any local authority to approach the officials that I have to let us know where they think that they struggle a little bit with all of this. And we will help where we can. I do think that some of this is about culture change, though. A lot of it is about culture change. And I think we've all got a job of work to do in all of that. I think we need to look at what has happened in the past. Because, as I pointed out earlier, as a councillor, and I'm sure others around the table found the same, there was no difficulty in using CPOs when it came to transport projects, but there was always reasons given why it would be unwise to do so when it came to housing and regeneration. And yet, what we have seen in certain areas is very little difficulty at all, including in some very major projects. Glasgow Commonwealth Games Village, for example, or Dundee Waterfront. You know, CPOs were used there very, very well indeed. And I think, you know, sometimes this is about leadership and embracing the change to move forward.
Just a quick supplementary. I mean, is the Minister aware of COSLA having instructed or encouraged any such consideration of perhaps confidence issues as to why particular councils don't proceed on, if you term it, the domestic front? And if he's not aware of COSLA taking such action, would it not actually now be a possibility for the Minister to encourage COSLA to do that very thing? Because if it is a question of a culture change that is needed, the sooner we start, including the Minister, encouraging through his role COSLA to do that, the better, because then we can speed all this up a bit, because otherwise it's just going to take quite a long time to tackle the issue through CPO.
Convener, off the top of my head, I can't remember how long ago it is since I wrote to COSLA and to individual local authorities about this issue. What I will do is we'll undertake to write to COSLA and to all of the local authorities again, outlining what we have done at the help and support that we can help provide, and to look to see what they're doing in terms of those cultural changes.
Okay, thank you.
Kenny, you wanted to add?
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. Morning, Minister. There's 105,000 empty properties in Scotland according to the National Records of Scotland, and 24,471 have now been empty for 12 months or more, and there's a myriad reasons why that should be the case. But I share the disappointment of other members in terms of the issue of CSOs. As Andy Whiteman pointed out, consultation was undertaken in 2015. There's a manifesto commitment, and while I think we all realise that Brexit will occupy many of our minds, and no doubt the work of officers and officials of the Scottish Government, is there any reason why legislation can't perhaps be brought forward for the year 2021? When one assumes most of the Brexit fiasco will have subsided and will be in a much more stable position one way or the other. For the communities I represent, many of which are blighted by these empty properties, it's more of an issue than some of the things that were put forward at the programme for government yesterday in terms of the legislative programme for the next year. And I think this is something that could make a major difference to so many people in so many communities. I would therefore ask why it's not higher up the list of government priorities.
Convener, I wish that the Brexit fiasco will see a subsidence by 2021, but I'm not convinced of that situation. As this committee is well aware, I don't commit myself to anything unless I know that I can deliver it. And I think that where we are at, it would be unwise for me to commit to being able to bring forward that legislation in 2021. Convener, the government always keeps these things under review, but I think I've been open, honest and transparent today around about where I see and where the government see this being at this moment. I understand the frustration that Mr Gibson has come out with there, and I understand the frustration of communities, and I want to do my level best to ensure that we do everything possible to bring empty homes back into use. But I'm not going to make a commitment here today that I don't think I would be able to deliver on.
I can understand the Minister's position. He has been very open and frank. I think the committee really appreciate that. But it wasn't 2021, it was 2020-21. I was looking to see whether legislation could be taken forward, and I would just urge the Minister, when he discusses with his colleagues, I realise he's not in the Cabinet itself, but about the importance of this, so that when we have a programme for government next year, this could be included in the programme for government for 2021. I think that would be something that many people across Scotland would certainly appreciate, and so I would be looking for a commitment. If you can't commit to introduce the legislation, at least commit to try and press for the introduction of that legislation, because I think it would be a real major feather in your cap if you were able to get that in the programme for government next year and have it delivered by the spring of 2021.
Convener, Mr Gibson doesn't ask very much of me, does he? I think as well as the situation around about legislation and the Brexit scenario, some of the things that we have been discussing here today are not straightforward. The Scottish Land Commission proposals are extremely welcome, but they are not as simple as many may think. I think we have a duty, all of us, to make sure that the legislation that we put forward on these issues is absolutely spot on right, because I think it is legislation that would survive, will have to survive for many, many years. So it's not just the parliamentary timetable and Brexit, although I think that is a huge amount of the difficulty in all of this. We also have to make sure, I have to make sure that officials are doing all that they possibly can to make sure that anything that we move forward on is absolutely spot on.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
I look forward to seeing you with that cap on, Minister. Before we move on to Graham Simpson, just a previous point that Graham actually raised about Edinburgh and empty homes officers. On the 5th of June, Andrew Mitchell from Edinburgh City Council was here saying that they were actively recruiting an empty homes officer. Now, I don't know where they are with it, but just to put it on the record that they recognise the need for one.
Ms Hepburn is just writing me a note saying that we are aware that they are looking at that. The sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned, Convener. And beyond that, I'll use the opportunity again to say to the other local authorities that have yet to appoint empty homes officers, that I hope that they too will be recruiting shortly.
Thank you. Graham?
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and thanks for that reminder. I'd forgotten that, but it's good to get it on the record. Minister, can I move on to another issue? And I think you touched on it in your opening remarks, and that's around council tax exemptions. Before I go on to my specific question, you said in your opening remarks that you were going to have a review of council tax statistics. That's not necessarily a council tax exemption. Perhaps you could explain what that means.
We will look at all of this, Convener, in the round. You know, there are various statistics that are batted about in terms of empty homes. Some of the statistics that I've seen used by some members of the opposition include things like tied homes, homes where folk are in care and are in hospital or in prison. These are still folks' homes, and yet folks are saying that these are empty homes. We'll look at the statistics in the round, and Mr Simpson can be assured that we will also look at all aspects of the levy, how it is working. I think that we have put in place something which is extremely flexible. I think that local authorities who have not taken advantage of some of these things should look at this to see what can be done. But we will look at all of this in the round. Like the committee, I want to ensure that we decrease as much as we possibly can the amount of empty homes that are here in Scotland. And I welcome, as I said earlier, your inquiry here, and I look forward with some anticipation to your recommendations, and you can be assured that I will consider all of them.
So you'll have been following the evidence that we've taken on this, and you'll have heard, as we've heard, that on the council tax exemption there's an inconsistent approach across the country, and where it was introduced, I mean, it's been introduced for very good reasons, but in some council areas the way they're applying it is actually a hindrance in getting properties back into use. So if somebody, for example, has an empty property that they're trying to renovate, and then they're being hit with this huge council tax bill, that can actually slow down or completely halt the renovation, which is not the intention. We've seen that in a number of council areas. So is that something that you would be looking at in this review?
Convener, the levy itself was introduced with the intention that it would act as an incentive to encourage private sector homeowners to bring their property back into use, rather than simply being a revenue-raising tool. The powers are discretionary, and they lie with councils, and I think that's rightly so. Because the government is often accused of being centralising. Councils themselves should use these powers logically, in my opinion, and they should look at individual circumstances in some cases. I would encourage those who have blanket policies, which often do not work, to look at their peers and see what can be done here. in order to get this absolutely right, and to adopt that flexible approach, which I think is right for everyone. We have already updated our guidance on this to clarify the flexibility that each local authority has. And those flexibilities and the policies that they should put in place should be there to meet the needs of their area and there to bring more homes, empty homes, back in to use. I will continue to look at all of this. What I don't want to do, convener, is to create a national blanket policy in all of this, because I don't think that that's the right thing to do. But I would hope that local authorities who are maybe implementing blanket policies, and maybe some would accuse of using these powers for revenue-raising purposes rather than the purpose of bringing homes back into use, would look at the benefits of doing it in the way that exemplar authorities are.
I mean, we visited Kilmarnock, where they have a blanket policy, and we visited a property which is being done up, and the owner of that property was bemoaning the fact that he's been hit with this extra bill, which is hindering the project. We heard evidence from South Lanarkshire Council, who also have a blanket policy, who appear to be in denial about the effects of that. You know, is there another job? I mean, you seem to be, you know, racking up the things that you're going to have to write to councils about, but in this session. But maybe this is another one where you could be highlighting to those councils that have blanket policies the effect of that, and highlighting best practice elsewhere.
Convener, you know, we can add it into the letter that I've already agreed. I've got absolutely no problem in highlighting best practice. I think that, you know, as it stands at the moment, the Empty Homes Partnership and Shahina Din highlight best practice to a great degree. I've got no problem about following suit in that regard. I would, once again, highlight to the committee and to others out there, you know, that where best practice is in play, you know, we're going to see some real differences in communities. And the Dumfries and Galloway scenario is the best example, I think, at this moment. They have made good use of the discretion provided by the legislation, and are going to use a proportion of the funds that they have acquired to support their empty homes work. That is what I want to see. I think that those folks who rely on blanket policy only are probably doing the folk that they represent a disservice. And they should look at their policies. We have refreshed the guidance. We'll continue to look at all of this, and I'm more than happy to highlight Mr Simpson's points once again to local authorities.
Okay.
Yes, just briefly on that point, does the Minister feel that the best practice approach should include an on-site inspection? Because we had a session with a number of folk, an informal session, and one of the bugbears that they raised was, well, you know, there's no dialogue with a number of local authorities. They don't even come out and look at what it is they're pontificating about. They're not interested. And that surely is, they're there to serve the public. Surely that's not good enough, Minister. And hopefully this letter encouraging best practice could specifically refer to the advisability of being willing to go out and have an on-site inspection.
Convener, I will go back and look at some of the evidence that you have had. I think it would be fair to say that I haven't really looked at it over the course of the recess, but I will go back and have a look again and look to see what folk are saying and look to encouraging local authorities to get this absolutely right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask one thing on that? When council has a blanket policy, is there ever a requirement for an explanation about why they have such a policy and why there's no flexibility about the policy?
No, we don't have that built in, convener. I'll go back and look at all of this again. I'm not going to commit to anything here and now, because what I don't want is to come up with national blanket policies for these things, because that is not the way to do it. But what you can be assured of is that we will cooperate with Shelter and with other partners to ensure that we highlight the best practice and encourage local authorities to follow suit with that best practice. And, you know, although we have already, as I said, refreshed the guidance, we'll look, if necessary, to do that again.
Okay, thank you. Andy, you wanted to come on?
Just following up on this council tax, I mean, obviously this discretion has been provided to local authorities through secondary legislation. I mean, would it not be possible to consider, and will you consider, amending the secondary legislation to the effect that, for example, it could contain a provision that the discretionary powers should be only used where the council are satisfied that its use will indeed encourage or whatever. In other words, to provide some statutory caveats to make sure that there is a process in place there where councils have to satisfy themselves of certain conditions before they impose the additional council tax. Would that not assist?
Convener, I don't want to overly complicate things, but what I will say to the committee is that we'll look at that as part of the review.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions to ask you around financial support. Minister, what consideration has been given to the introduction of further financial incentives to help more owners bring their properties back into use? And I suppose that would also include the Rural and Islands Housing Fund.
Convener, I mentioned earlier the work that we're doing with stakeholders at this moment in terms of housing to 2040. We'll consider that as part of the review and our approach to housing to 2040. Funding for repairs and renovations is a good example where previous interventions have proved successful in some areas and have struggled to get off the ground in others. Ms Hepburn and other officials are currently in discussions with a number of local authorities, Western Bartonshire on loan to occupy, and Falkirk on loan to sell, and East Ayrshire on conversion of empty buildings to affordable housing, to make the best use of the existing homes loan funding. And we're keen to offer flexibility, and you know that's one of the reasons why Ms Hepburn and I went to Falkirk to see if there was flexibility that could be built in to allow them to do even more. Reviewing the use of funds and what is actually needed is something that I intend to take stock of during our review before deciding how we move forward. The data that is being gathered by the partnership will also help us in that move forward. As you know, Convener, I like to see myself as a man of common sense, and if we can build in flexibilities that make differences, then you know I'm happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. How do you see the role, if any, of the Scottish Government's housing investment programme to support the return of empty properties? Convener,
you know, I want to ensure that local authorities, again, have the flexibility to be able to use, for example, affordable housing supply money to tackle some problems. Now, if that means that local authorities think that the acquisition of empty homes is required in their area, and that those homes are required, it shows that they're needed and there are demand for them. Again, we have got flexibility in the system allowing local authorities to make those acquisitions. You know, we have already seen over the piece a number of local authorities acquiring homes for various reasons, and not necessarily empty homes, I would hasten to add. Those flexibilities are there. My officials are always willing to talk to local authorities around about flexibility. Obviously, you know, we have to scrutinise what is going on in that regard, but, you know, we are flexible.
Okay, thank you. I've just got two last questions to ask you on data. Can you provide us with more information on how the data exercise will provide a more accurate picture of empty homes across Scotland? And do we need anything further to be done?
I'm quite happy to write to the committee around about data so that you've got all of the knowledge at your fingertips. And if the committee requires anything else, as you well know, Convener, I'm more than happy to provide.
Thank you. And my very last question for you, Minister. Would you find it helpful in your work on empty homes if all local authorities reported to you regularly on their progress in bringing empty homes back into use? If so, how could this information be incorporated into national performance indicators for measuring progress on housing and regeneration outcomes?
Convener, I think that we already get a fair amount of data through the partnership and various other submissions. In terms of national indicators, I don't know if that is necessarily a requirement. I don't like too much bureaucracy, as folks well know, but you know, we will reflect in all of this as we move forward in the review to see if there is a requirement for more data.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Can I thank you and your officials for attending today's session. As I said earlier, that's our concluding evidence session, and the committee will consider a draft report to Parliament at a later meeting. I suspend this meeting to allow the Minister to leave the table. Item 3 is the consideration of negative instrument 210 as listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper number 3, which contains further detail. This instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it. No motions to annul have been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument at its meeting on 23rd of September 2019 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Do members have any comments on the instrument? No. Okay, thank you. In that case, are we agreed? Thank you. That ends the... Sorry, hold on. Right, okay. Sorry, I invite the comment to agree it does not wish to make any recommendation in relation to the instrument. Thank you. That ends the public part of the meeting, and I now move this meeting into private.